Listen, I'm gonna start this video with a hot take. Convergent Pokemon are better than regionals, and it's not even close. Even though Gen 9 only gave us 3 lines of this new class of Pokemon, I've fallen in love with these little pocket monsters in both design and concept. For the uninitiated, Convergents are just Pokemon that look like other Pokemon but are unrelated. This is a phenomenon that's actually pretty prevalent in the real world. So in this video, I will be going over why I think Convergent Pokemon are not only far superior to regionals, but how they'll also solve a crisis that's been brewing since Gen 7. Even though Gen 7 is my favorite generation, regional variants have always been a complicated subject that I rarely hear people discuss. On the positive side of things, it revitalized old Pokemon and sometimes made them meta. It added on to the world building of Pokemon and made the environment of the games feel a bit more realistic and grounded, despite the obvious absurdity of some of the transformations. However, that came with a trade-off: less original Pokemon. What do I mean by this? Let me break it down. The first 5 generations of Pokemon all introduced well over 100 new entries per game, with Gen 5 producing the most at 156 Pokemon. Gen 6, however, had a huge drop-off, only introducing 72 unique Pokemon. While that may sound like a lot, you have to understand that you really gotta divide this number by a rough guesstimate of like, I don't know, 2, as a lot of these Pokemon are interconnected through
evolution, a chop, a chop, a champ, evolution, Charmander, Chameleon, Charizard.
Sure, there are 72 new Pokemon, but my Fletchling over there is going to count for 3 of them. This can sometimes lead to the region feeling a bit lackluster in some areas. As for many types, there's only 1 or 2 lines created for that game, limiting team options if you're like me and want to fully utilize the brand new encounters at your disposal. However, I'll give Gen 6 a pass because they introduced 48 Mega Evolutions, bumping them to a solid 120. Watch my other video on Pokemon gimmicks if you want to hear more about my thoughts on Megas and Regionals in a bit more depth in regards to Pokemon overall. But here we're focusing just on Regionals. In Gen 7, they introduced 87 new entries to the game, still not breaking 100. But this time, they didn't have Megas to boost their numbers. Enter regional variants. You see, while these Pokemon look a lot like their original counterparts, they're really different Pokemon entirely. With type changes, ability changes, move pool overhauls, reskin, design changes, and even changing their stat distribution, the only constant between all regional variants is they are based on an old Pokemon, and their base stat total stays the same. Sound familiar? So, if regional variants and convergent Pokemon are so similar, near identical in execution, what am I even trying to argue? How are convergent Pokemon so much better than regional variants? Am I washed? Am I yapping? Am I a Gen 1er of Gen Z and clinging so desperately onto a past of simpler times when the worst of my worries was whether or not that Volcarona had a bug gem? I'll tell you how they're better. One word: reusability. Re-implementability. They can be easier put into later games. You see, regionals and convergence, as we've established before, are near identical in execution, yet completely different in concept from a lore perspective. And although this may seem irrelevant to my competitive audience, this is actually an important key detail to both competitive and casual players alike. As with Dexit slashing our options since 2019, we are at the mercy of Game Freak's decision of which soulless 3D sprites will be gracing our battlefields. And since Pokemon like Alolan Persian and Galarian Rapidash are, well, Alolan and Galarian, it makes it much harder to implement them into later generations. Maybe 1 or 2 of them could be slipped into the main game via trade, sure, but with each generation growing this roster of regionals, it means these Pokemon are pretty much locked to their original region, and they definitely can't just throw them in the grass on Route 9. No, it needs to be some sort of event or side quest, tying back into my earlier point of the diversity of newer Pokemon games sometimes feeling a bit emptier. Taking this point one step further, Gen 8 started a new trend for regionals that solidified my dislike for them even more: their evolutions. While I do love the designs of some of these, it just presents another hole Game Freak dug themselves. They're damaging the usefulness of older Pokemon. Back in the day, Pokemon got new evolutions all the time, and it was great. Now, Pokemon like Lanoon and Mr. Mime not only get completely revamped into new Pokemon, usually already superior to their predecessors, but given an evolution. Except that they really aren't, because the original counterparts of these Pokemon don't get an evolution, making them have somewhat of a spotlight in their home region, but afterwards completely irrelevant again. Stacking that with Gen 7 showing us the trigger for these regional designs are from living and being in that region and not just being born Alolan in the first place, all this information combines into a position where so many cool Pokemon are introduced, yet abandoned or loosely implemented in future titles, with less actual options for Game Freak to pick to fill out their routes. Convergent Pokemon, however, solve this. Since their differences in lore alone, it allows us to continue revamping older Pokemon, but since they're not stated anywhere to be tied to the region of Paldea, or any region, it means they can just reuse convergent lines in later generations. No strings, no complications, no gymnastics. They can bring back these Pokemon to future routes as much as they want, just as they could for Lechonk or Gimmighoul. Okay, to recap. Convergent and regionals are, for all intents and purposes, identical to each other in execution, but their concepts are different enough where convergence can be more easily returned to players in following generations, allowing for our dexes to remain plentiful, our regions diverse, and Game Freak's creativity to be at an all-time high for a team trying to make original designs for a roster that's already breaking quadruple digits. Just to make things clear, I don't hate regional variants, it's just convergence are better. Justice for all the Pokemon who missed out on an evolution. You know, alternatively, they could just remove Dexit and this issue would only be like half as bad.